let's go ahead and look at the specific functions of connective tissue. So one of the first things that we find connective tissue doing is it encloses organs and separates them from each other. So this is what loose connective tissue is. And so I like to think of it as kind of like a mesh around the different organs in our body. So it's going to be holding all those different things in place, but also separating them from each other. The next function of connective tissue is that, of course, it's going to connect, hence the name, connective tissue. It goes ahead and makes sure that our bones are connected to each other and that our muscles stay connected to our bones so we can actually lift things and write and do all the things that we do. And we find that connecting things is done by dense connective tissue, the really strong tissue. So as I said before, we're going to go ahead and look at each of those specific types of connective tissue more in depth. Right now we're just looking at the functions. So the third function for connective tissue is that it's for support and movement. This is where we go ahead and find where bones come into place and joints and cartilage. So of course bones are going to be supporting our structure. If we didn't have bones, we'd just be a big pile of organs and blood and veins and all that good stuff and skin. So we definitely have to have our bones for structure. And then to have movement, we have to have those cartilage pieces that join our bones together. We also have to have that dense connective tissue to connect our muscle to bone so that we can go ahead and move and contract things. All right, the next slide here is going to show the last functions for connective tissue. Number 4 is storage. So fat, as we said, adipose tissue is really good for storing energy. So fat has a lot more energy than we find in carbohydrates or in proteins, which is why we go ahead and use it to store energy. We also find that bone is really important in storing calcium. So one of the functions for connective tissue is storage. The next one is cushioning and insulation, and we find that's also what adipose tissue is really good at. Women and ladies, we know that we have a higher body fat percentage than our male counterparts because we actually have that to help us have more energy storage and also just be a little more cushiony, and we have more insulation, all those things for having a baby, pretty much. So evolution was kind to us, gave us lots of extra fat to go ahead and make sure we could produce really healthy babies and keep ourselves healthy at the same time. So that connective tissue, adipose tissue, is really important for that piece as well. The next part that we see is transportation, and that's transportation within the body. So that's not moving from one place to the next. So this is where blood comes into place. Blood goes ahead and transports carbon dioxide out of the body. Blood's also going to go ahead and take oxygen from the lungs to the rest of the body, to the cells, all the way at your fingertips, etc. So blood is there for transportation. That last one is protection, and it's not just the bones that cover our heart and the bones that cover our reproductive organs or any of those kind of things. Those obviously are for protection, but it also includes the immune system that we find, the cells of the immune system that we find within our blood. So our blood doesn't just contain red blood cells, it also has white blood cells and neutrophils and lymphocytes and all these different cells that are really important in snagging any intruders that come into our body and getting rid of them within the blood. Okay, so let's look at a couple of these. We'll look at all the different types of connective tissue a little bit more closely. So the first one we're going to look at is loose connective tissue. So loose connective tissue, its main function is to go ahead and, like I said, create that mesh around the different organs to contain them in one spot and also to separate them from other organs. So we find it beneath the skin and between the muscles. I know that some of you probably have been hunting before, One of the things you can think about here is if you go ahead and skin an animal, most of the time it's pretty easy because all you're disconnecting is that loose connective tissue between the skin and the underlying dense connective tissue beneath. So that's the stuff that you're just ripping through. On Monday, we'll see with our chicken leg lab, we'll see a lot of loose connective tissue covering that. So you'll get to see that it's pretty easy to go ahead and break apart, and that it's just a really thin membrane that's containing different things and separating them. All right, our next one, we'll see here, this is a picture, an artist's rendition of loose connective tissue. The biggest thing that I want you to note here is the difference between epithelial and connective tissue. So epithelial tissue had a ton of cells, whereas in this one, all we see right here is this one little cell right here. We have another cell back here, another cell over here, one here, one here. So overall, we have 5 cells, right? So whereas when we were looking at epithelial tissue, we had hundreds, if not thousands of these cells that we saw, especially in stratified, we saw them stacked up. Whereas here with our loose connective tissue, our connective tissue in general, we do not have as many cells. Everything else around here, that's just matrix. So in this case with loose connective tissue, we notice it kind of makes this lattice structure with all these different proteins here. So we have elastic fibers and collagenous fibers. These are all proteins that are going to go ahead and help connect things together to make that mesh that's going to cover organs and separate them. All right, so our next one is adipose connective tissue. Again, adipose is fat. So this tissue is there to go ahead and store fat. It has very little matrix, which makes it a little bit different than your normal connective tissue. And we'll look more closely at why that is. Of course, like I said, fat holds a lot more energy. You get a lot more energy from it than proteins or carbohydrates, so that's what we go ahead and use to store that extra energy is fat. So we find it beneath the skin. It's in certain abdominal membranes or regions, and it's also around the kidneys, the heart, and our joints. So once you've gone ahead and written down the functions and the locations, I want you to take a minute just to think about, okay, why would we have fat around the heart? And why would we go ahead and have fat around our joints? Why would we have it beneath the skin? And remember, we talked about, okay, adipose tissue is there to cushion and insulate. It's also there to be an energy source and to store fat. So we said cushioning, insulation, storage of fat, energy source. So why would we go ahead, if those are the functions of adipose tissue, why would we have it around the kidneys, around the heart, and around the joints? So go ahead, take a minute, talk to a person next to you. If you're done taking your notes, talk to them about why would we go ahead and find fat or adipose tissue around these different regions. Okay, go, take a minute. All right, so I'm sure you guys had some good ideas. One of the ones that I'm used to hearing is, why would we have fat around the heart? Well, of course, our heart has to be able to have energy constantly because it's always got to be beating, so that energy source could be there. Also, I've heard that that's for insulation, so if you get really cold, you still have that extra fat around your heart. And for cushioning, if you get major blows to the chest, any of those kind of things. Of course, on the joints, I know I've got some athletes in here. What do you go ahead and use all the time if you're jumping up and down? You're going to be using your knees, right? Lots of force we put on our knees. And so that's where we go ahead and have a joint. Those bones are going to be there and having lots of pressure against them, bumping into each other, all that good stuff. So we have to have adipose tissue there to kind of help with that cushioning so we're not just ramming our, our joints together and breaking things. So here's one picture of adipose tissue. If you didn't know already, breasts are just big old lumps of fat, okay? So all that yellow stuff, that is adipose tissue. And it's actually, it really does look like this. This kind of, it's gross. Hopefully we have some on our chicken legs and you can see them a little bit better, that adipose tissue there. Another picture here, this is not an artist's rendition. This is actually an image of adipose tissue. So one of the things I want you to note here, this cell, this is an entire cell here. So we can see there's the nucleus, there's a lot of the cell organelles, etc. there, but they're all together. So the cell's membrane actually does go around this whole entire fat droplet. The fat droplet is in the cell. It's contained within the cell. So adipose tissue actually are cells, they're adipose cells that have storage areas where they go ahead and they just fill up with fat. And so this whole thing here is a cell. This whole thing here is an adipose cell. This thing here is an adipose cell. And one of the things you want to think about too is if it's cushioning, right, we don't want a whole lot of intercellular matrix. If we want insulation, we don't want a whole lot of empty spaces there. So it's actually pretty good. It's all shoved together in here nice and tight versus that loose connective tissue that we looked at. Here's an artist's rendition again of the same thing, those fat droplets there, and then cells around them. All right, so our next one is dense connective tissue. Dense connective tissue, again, is opposite of that loose connective tissue. It's very, very strong, has lots of fibers of collagen, and we find it within our tendons and our ligaments. Also, we find it in the white portions of our eye, or the sclera. So if you poke your eyeball, it's, it's pretty tough stuff. That's actually dense connective tissue. We also find it within the deep layers of our skin. So when we looked at epithelial tissue, we looked at that segment of skin, we saw there was the epithelial tissue on top, there was loose connective tissue underneath, and then there was dense connective tissue underneath that. So one of the things that I want you to write down right above tendons and ligaments is to classify what those actually are. So tendons are going to go ahead and be connections between muscles and bone. So they connect a muscle to a bone. So a tendon is going to connect our bicep to our shoulder blade, or bicep to whatever other bones are around there. We're going to go ahead and connect those together. Ligaments are going to connect bone to bone. Okay, so tendons, I want you to write that down. Tendons are muscle to bone, and ligaments are bone to bone. So again, tendons are muscle to bone, and ligaments are bone to bone. So we're going to take a look at some pictures here. If you missed that, here's a picture of a tendon going ahead and connecting there to that shoulder joint, and also there to the shoulder blade. And here, this is the knee, and we can see ligament connecting those two bones together, and then the tendon connecting that muscle to bone. We also find dense connective tissue in a couple other areas. Now, this is a specific type of dense connective tissue. We call it dense elastic connective tissue. The reason it's elastic is because, remember, that property means that it can go ahead and go back to its original shape when it's been stretched. So we find it within our aorta and also in our vocal cords. So whenever you go ahead and you do a big race or you work out really, really hard, you're going to be pumping a lot more blood and a lot higher pressure through your aorta. So it needs to be able to stretch And then after, of course, you go ahead and cool down, it needs to go ahead and return back to its regular shape. So that's one of the reasons that we find here that we have dense connective tissue. It has to be able to withhold a large amount of force and pressure, but also go back to its original shape. This is another picture of dense connective tissue. You can see it's a lot different than that loose connective tissue. The loose had kind of that lattice-looking structure, had a lot of space in between it. It had not as many fibers, whereas this one we just have fiber on fiber on fiber, and then just a couple of cells throughout here. So lots of fiber going through. Again, here's another image for us of all those collagen fibers, and then the nuclei there of those different fibroblasts, or the cells that make up dense connective tissue. All right, so cartilage is our next piece.